Good afternoon, everyone. It is summer, and it's all of a sudden it's pretty hot here in the Cape, and we are about to get going with our final webinar for the year, and my final webinar for this kind of hosting space. So I'm quite excited to get into it. I was at Cosmos today as well. And just to remind people to go out and get to the botanical gardens. There's generally a nice stream and a cool spot. But if this is your first time signing in, I'm Rupert Koopman, presenting this on behalf of the Botanical Society. And today we are going to talk about food. And we've got 4 panelists, and 2 are pre-recorded. But I just wanted to say, because of the richness of this material, we are definitely going to go over 6 o'clock. So if you can't make it to the end, remember you could always check out the recording on the YouTube channel. Right, formalities are over. Let me just check the Q&A. People are welcome to put their questions in there. We won't be taking questions during the presentations, or we'll answer them at the end. Also, there's the chat box, and people are welcome to say where they're tuning in from, how they're doing. It'd be lovely to hear who's on the call. So we're going to start by going up to Pretoria. So Richard, hey, stick your camera on. I'd like to introduce Richard Hay, who is, please read out your own title. It's a long one.
I am the Conservation Project Coordinator for the Northern Region for the Botanical Society. And then I am also Curator of the Future Africa Indigenous and Orphan Crops Collection at the Manie van der Schijff Botanical Garden here at the University of Pretoria.
Excellent. And then also I see the Greaves in Scottborough are here and so forth. Just to remind everyone, now that you've recovered from the Great Southern BioBlitz weekend, that you've still got another week to upload your observations and to do the identifications. Okay, so formalities all over. Richard, go ahead and tell us about growing these plants.
Cool. Can I share?
Oh, yeah. And I need to, yeah, I'm going to make you host.
Great. Cool. So, as Richard introduced myself, I am Richard. I am actually an agronomist by training, so very much from the agriculture side of the agro-food system. And I am the new curator of the Future Africa collection here at the University of Pretoria. I'm very passionate about orphan and indigenous crops. There is a huge diversity of crops out there that I don't believe we are making full use of, and it's now my life's mission to make these crops more accessible to people and get them into home gardens, food gardens, community-centered projects, and into various forms of agriculture. Just a bit about Future Africa. So Future Africa is a 3.5 hectare campus at the University of Pretoria. It's situated on the larger Innovation Africa campus, which is our experimental farm. And the entire landscape of Future Africa is designed as an urban forage and food garden. We host just over 200 species on the campus, with everything either being edible or medicinal in some way, shape, or form. The entire campus is designed to harvest rainwater, which then gets funneled into this dam that you see on the bottom left, and that dam water is then used to irrigate the space. A lot of these pictures are from the early days of the campus. Our gardens are far more established now, and our collection continues to grow every day. The gardens on the campus supply both the restaurants on site, which is that building that you see in the top right. It feeds residences, and then a lot of the produce also gets fed into research, both from an agricultural perspective, which I'll talk about, and into the food and culinary sciences perspective, which Dr. Hennie Fisher will talk about later. So obviously, as BotSoc, we really focused on indigenous plant species. A lot of the stuff on the Future Africa campus is indigenous, although not entirely. So just some species of interest that I always like to highlight. On the left here, we have Mondia whitei, Umondi or white ginger. This is an endangered species from KZN that we have been actively propagating. It is an incredibly vigorous climber. It's actually become a weed in our Hatfield campus. But the bark and the roots are used in traditional medicine. It's a great flavorant to add into alcohols like gin. On the top right there, we have Kai apples. That's actually a crate that I delivered to Hennie in his kitchen this morning from our trees at Future Africa. We are also looking at indigenous herbs like Talbachia. So that Talbachia in the bottom right there, it's actually a hybrid which tastes exactly like chives. So we're very interested in this particular selection. But more recently, with me coming on board as an agricultural scientist, as an agronomist, we have expanded our scope a bit to also include locally indigenous land races. So that loofah that you see in the center there, that's a landrace that we picked up in Linyenye in Limpopo, just out on a farm. And it seems to be one of the most vigorous loofahs we have ever encountered. It's a really weedy specimen, and so it's great for home owners. If you don't know what loofahs are, they're those sponges that you buy at the body shop. And they're a great plastic-free alternative sponge. So working with all of these indigenous crops, we really want to try push them, get them out there, and like I said, make them accessible. And the first step in this process for us has been just raising awareness of the sheer diversity of crop species out there. Obviously, being a university, we are deeply entwined with the education of our students. And so our starting point was a little pilot project that we've termed the Giving Garden. This is a space within the Manie van der Schijff Botanical Garden up on main campus that we've cleared out and are putting student practicals in there to give students some real world experience growing these orphan and indigenous crops, making them aware of the diversity and giving them the practical experience to understand what it takes to get a crop from planting all the way to harvest. Obviously, there's a very different mindset to a typical botanical gardens collection, which is all about the maintenance of those genetics. Here, we are trying to get these students to actually produce and harvest from the system. So these students that you see here are my PPK students. These are second year agricultural science students doing a module in sustainable crop production system. But we also have students from other institutions. These are my TUT interns at the moment who very recently put in this mountain papaya little orchard that we have. The space is not just for teaching. We also use it as a backup collection of a lot of the stuff at Future Africa. So things like the marama beans that you see on the right here, Tylocelum esculentum, are now being backed up here as a safeguard to maintain the material that we have, but also to increase our propagation potential of the site. Working with these students and with a number of food gardens in and around the city of Tshwane metropolitan municipality, we realized that there's a huge need to give support to home growers and community growers to help them produce more out of their gardens. And we think a lot of these orphan and indigenous crops have huge potential, largely because they are very tough. They're well adapted to fairly harsh conditions. It makes them an easier option, particularly for beginner gardeners who are just getting into the idea of growing and producing. And so working with Jason Sampson, my colleague, and the curator, larger curator of the Manie van der Schijff Botanical Garden, we've identified what we are terming the Dirty Seven. These are orphan and indigenous crops that we think have the most potential for feeding communities, getting them into gardens. These are all tough as nails plants. Not all of them are indigenous. They come from various parts of the world, but we think these are an absolute must for any home food grower. The top left, we have Jerusalem artichokes, which is a type of tuber-forming sunflower from North America. At the middle at the top there is Tsenzo, which I will talk in depth about just now. That is an indigenous species. It's a grassland shrub that forms these finger-like tubers. And then to the right of that is Yakon, another tuber-forming crop, this time from the Andes. Bottom left is Muchaina. It's a landrace of a disputed brassica species. We're not entirely sure its exact species. We picked this up from Venda in northern Limpopo. The right of that, Ethiopian kale, a very tough leafy vegetable which throws 1.5 meter taproot from the Ethiopian highlands. The little onions that you see there are Egyptian walking onions. These are a very tough onion that instead of flowering produces these little bulbils on the edge. And then our seventh member of the Dirty Seven is any sort of landrace or heirloom tomato that's pretty tough. I include this cultivar Black Beauty just because it's my favorite. My colleague Jason prefers Togo Market, but we work quite closely with a number of companies, including Living Seeds, just testing out some of their heirloom stuff to see what works. They are also doing a great job, and I'm going to punt them here just because they really are one of my favorite seed companies. They are taking great lengths to make all of the stuff that we've identified as having huge potential for home gardens accessible to the public. And as part of this mission, we are ramping up our propagation of these species. It's obviously when you're maintaining a botanical garden, you've got limited space, but we've decided that this is a cause we want to throw our hearts at and make all of these crops that we think have huge potential available to the public, to home growers, to community projects, small-scale farmers. So here we just have some pictures of this year's propagation efforts. The Zayaan on the left there, the Kai apple seeds that I picked up from Hennie today, which is going into our next propagation round, and then low-felt chestnuts. But obviously my background as an agricultural scientist, I am thinking a bit more than the average home garden. I really want to see small-scale farmers moving away from the more conventional crops and vegetables towards these niche vegetables. Not just to expand the agrobiodiversity that small-scale farmers in South Africa are growing, but also because I think there's a huge opportunity for the small-scale guys who are limited with the amount of land that they have to really tap into niche markets and get these products out there where commercial farmers or large-scale commercial farmers wouldn't necessarily want to go. So Rupert asked me to talk briefly just about what goes into a field trial. And so I'll talk specifically about Senza because this is something I'm working on quite closely. Agronomic field trials are a lot of work. They require a lot of material. When I first started looking into Senza 3 years ago, we had 4 or 5 plants in the Botanical Gardens collection. And it took me 2.5 years of active propagation to get enough material for our first small-scale trial, which was last year. This is looking at the effect of tuber size on tuber production. The reason I'm very passionate about Senza specifically is because it is incredibly drought and heat tolerant. It is well adapted to our very hostile grasslands. And so putting it into a field where even a minor amount of attention like weeding really showed some great results producing these tubers. I do believe in the future, this is a crop that will compete with potatoes. At the moment, we are just looking at the very basic agronomy. Obviously, if you're trying to market these weird and wonderful crops to farmers, we need to come with a management plan. We need to give them instructions on how to best look after this crop. It's not just about sticking it in the ground and leaving it. There is a lot of work that goes into maintaining those fields and ensuring a viable harvest at the end of the season. And so the work that I'm focused on now is looking at different types of management practices to increase tuber production, and then also quantifying baseline water use efficiencies for this crop so that we can demonstrate that it is, in fact, a very tough water-wise crop and should be going into breeding programs to try to produce higher yielding cultivars. A lot of the issues with these orphan crops, they're not as high yielding as the commercial crops that we're used to, but this is purely because they haven't received any attention. And so we've started the introductory work looking at breeding Senza. This little picture in the middle here with these green tubers, this is something we were trying last year to see if we can get polypoid tubers. If you think back to the picture that I showed earlier, there was a fairly small tuber cluster. Our idea here is to get bigger, rounder, more appealing tubers for the market so that the likes of Hennie Fisher can really demonstrate the potential of this crop. And then just to end with my favorite quote, and this is Norman Borlaug, is a world-renowned agronomist. He's the father of the Green Revolution. It's what inspires us to do this work and to put in that work in the fields and get these crops out there, tell people like you, and then always just to thank my collaborators and sponsors at the university. But I hope that gave everyone a brief introduction into the work that we're doing, making these crops available. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Could you just make me a host again?
Yeah, you should be host there.
Great. Thank you. Um, and I think that's a great practical kind of introduction into how we move, because we've been talking about indigenous crops for a very long time. There's Food from the Veld and all these other books that are fantastic, but it's now about like the next stage of getting things to a position where we know how much they produce and yield and consistency, which we're going to keep on talking about. But right now, we're gonna take a short left to Kenya, and unfortunately, Tapiwa Guzha couldn't join us this evening, but we pre-recorded yesterday, and Tapiwa runs a shop called Tapi Tapi in Observatory, which makes ice cream, um, and featuring indigenous to Africa flavors. And we'll put the link to his work. And if you just Google him, you'll find a lot of interviews. The questions I asked him were more along the lines of using our plants and the reactions that you get as someone who's customer facing. So we're now moving from the production side to the customer facing side. And I hope you find this as interesting as I did.
No, it would be just as spontaneous.
Good evening. You'll see from my shirt that this is pre-recorded. I'm here with Tapiwa Guzha. He's a wow. There's a long bio which you can Google, and then the short bio is a culture and identity advocate. And for the context of this conversation, it's with looking at culture and identity through Africa's, and especially sub-Saharan Africa's, indigenous flavors, and specifically because this is the Botanical Society, the plants. So thanks for joining us from Kenya, Tapiwa. Yeah, so I guess the first thing is and people can Google why ice cream, but you've obviously got an academic background as well in looking at our plants, and how has that kind of infiltrated the way you do your work, as opposed to you know, we've got a whole range of people in the food space. So I think where you and I have connected as well is the fact that you do have that scientific background, and then obviously your own unique flair, and then you look at the ingredients and go at it. So let's start with there. So the science.
I think the science was useful in terms of understanding how you can play around with ingredients and flavors if you're understanding that each plant is a set of chemical reagents that you can use in various combinations with other chemicals. So if you know an acid and a base always reacts together, if you take something like amasi or baobab and you combine that with something with a more alkaline pH or neutral pH like milk, you know you're going to potentially create new flavors. So from a point of coming up with unique flavors, understanding how flavor reactions work, how do we make aldehydes, how do we make ketones, it's actually been really, really useful. To a point now, though, it feels instinctual. I don't really think about it like that anymore. Like, let me sit and make a chemical reaction. I think about all my past experiences making ice cream or food in general. What are the sort of consistent themes, scientific themes throughout all of that? You know, if you're talking about plants that have a lot of mucilage, how can I use mucilage to the benefit of the product? So things like okra, things like fresh hibiscus, like chia seeds, all those things that have that, you know, gloopy texture, very, very vilified, I think, in food. People make a point of getting rid of that texture, that slimy texture. But in the context of ice cream, that gives you creaminess, that gives you smooth texture. and they prevent the formation of ice crystals, or they limit it. So you get the most creamy, soft ice cream possible. The challenge is, though, you have to eat it very cold, because then if it really melts, then the gloop comes back. Yeah. So there are plenty of ways in which the science shows up, and not only the science, but I think the analytical mind of science shows up as well. Yeah.
So that's fascinating because if you think about traditional so-called cuisine, like a French cuisine, then obviously there's been several hundred years worth of experimenting, and so now you cut through all that and just go to the source, and that's fantastic. And obviously you're from Zimbabwe, and obviously I'm down in the Cape, and my focus is very fynbos. And it's been very good for me from a palate point of view, and I'm sure lots of other people, to be exposed to the more kind of northeastern species and flavors and so forth. And that's what our other guests, Richard and the prof, will be looking at as well. They're working up in Pretoria. So tell us a bit more about those ingredients and procurement thereof, and like as a small business yourself, it's not like a lot of the standard ingredients you just pop down to the normal corner shop or your insert brand name store here, and get them. So you've got to be a bit more innovative. So two-part question: the northern flavors, or north to me anyway, flavors.
Everything is north to you.
Yes, exactly. growing up, and how you interact with that, and then secondly, where do you get your stuff?
So I think part of it is I was lucky to grow up in a family that had a lot of global networks from a very early point in my life. So I've had family living in England since the 70s, and a few other places around the world, which means also my parents, my mother, they're all well traveled and had a lot of African friends from different parts of the continent. So I never grew up with this idea of only Zimbabwean food, only Shona food. I was pretty exposed to a lot of West African food in particular from a young age. So that left me with an openness to trying other people's foods. And because my parents also well traveled, we were always eating in random places. So Italian food, French food, whatever. So when it came to focusing on flavors from the continent, it never came to my mind to say I'm only going to make exclusively South African or South African flavors, because I've always had a continental palate. I forgot it for a while, but when I came back to it, it was always going to be African. And so, but the challenge, like you brought up, is how do you acquire those resources? And also, how do you justify moving things from far away in the name of consumption? So I'll introduce a second question to your question, a sub-question. How do you find that balance between ecological issues and not consuming things locally? How do I balance that together with the work that I'm trying to do, which is encourage people to consume African flavors, to celebrate African flavors, to believe in our identities and our cultures? And for me, it's still at the point where the ecological concerns, the biodiversity concerns, the invasive concerns feel like equal weight to the human concerns that I'm trying to address as well. But I'm aware that with time, I need to wean off the rest of the continent, or alternatively, figure out a way of having localized ice cream spots in those different countries, right? So you can be a bit more authentic to those particular regions and also a bit more environmentally responsible. And so currently I just buy things in Cape Town, whatever's available in Cape Town that other immigrants have brought in already. I don't really procure things myself from a different part of the continent. The furthest I'll go is import maybe marula seeds from Limpopo, down to the Cape. But if I can't get it in Goodwood, Woodstock, Cape Town, Orbs, Salt River, odds are it's not going to show up on the menu.
Yeah.
Unless it's like some things are African, but the base of those things are now universal, they're global, right? So like if you say, what's a silly example, or a quick, easy enough example is like in the Cape, a cool sister is ubiquitous. And I always use this example because I think it connects a lot with people in the Cape. But none of the ingredients are Cape. Most of the spices are either Indian or Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, maybe Asian in general, and maybe South American as well, South American. But that aggregate of flavors into that one dish is very unique to the Cape. So obviously I can make that very easily. I don't have to worry about the geopolitical, ecological concerns because people are already moving those spices around anyway.
Totally. And that's the thing with ingredients is like, again, if you look at the chain stores, you can these days get something like cherries year round, but if you just read the label, it's coming from the Northern
Imported from,
Hemisphere
yeah.
or the rest of Africa, wherever the climate is right at that time. So it does start kind of the boundaries are dissolving in that way. Cool. So I guess let's talk about your kind of clients' responses to this, because the standard thing with ice cream is you go and you've got your set of 3 flavors: vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. And so people coming from that milieu stopping at your counter, what does that process look like?
So it's highly dependent on why the person has showed up. If they came with some kind of forewarning and context of what's going to happen, they're a lot more open because of, I think, pre-processed the concept and the process. So they're showing up because they're intrigued, or maybe they want to mock fun, or maybe they want to grab their Instagram selfie. Maybe they want to, what's that word or that phrase, like when you pretend to be woke so you can get the credit, like virtue signal.
Yeah, yes.
So like I'm down with Tapi, I'm pro Africa, I'm pro whatever. It's a nice optic, right? But some people show up with genuine interest and excitement. So depending on whether or not they knew why they were coming, they'll get exactly what they thought they were gonna get. And then sometimes you have the person who's walking past and they see ice cream, or their kid spots an ice cream cup or whatever, right? So those are a lot more visceral and a lot more in the moment kind of reaction. So you get to see the more honest opinion of how they're processing this new information. Some people can't believe it. Yeah, right. Some people can't believe it. They're excited for it, and then they're like, "I'm going in." Some people, you can see them trying to make it a thing that like their kid is fussy, so they only eat vanilla. Some people make a point of like, "Oh, these are very weird. No, thank you, I'm okay." Then they leave without even trying or waiting to hear the rest of the menu. You can see them losing interest. So that there is a whole range of different kind of reactions and different kind of, what it speaks to is different kind of upbringing and sensibility and resistance to diversity as well.
Yes.
So people from conservative backgrounds will struggle with the menu unless they've made effort to remove their mind from that conservative background.
Yeah, so there's a challenge for us to help the people around us decolonize the palate. So on that, the final question was from Richard's side, actually, is just like, is there any ingredient which has been kind of super polarizing where you've met resistance from people?
I think for the polarizing ingredients is normally conceptually, not from a flavor point of view. So we've done like caterpillars, we've done fish, we've done amasi, we've done avocado, we've done geraniums, and these are all flavors people will maybe associate with savory food. Or like egusi, like if you're talking about West Africans, egusi, or like teff, like
Yes.
injera pancakes or injera waffles, like people are like, no, this doesn't make any sense, right? So before they try it, they have that conceptual block, like, but I've been eating this for 60 years as a savory stew. Now you want to tell me it's an ice cream? It doesn't make sense. So if you get people to try it, typically they shift. You can see something shift in them, but that's often the most difficult thing is I have an affinity for this ingredient in a very specific context. Why are you changing my context? You know, like we use maize meal in so many different ways. In fact, flours in general, like sorghum meal, teff meal, fonio meal, different kinds of millets. And most people think pap or porridge.
Yes.
The furthest may be mortabella kind of porridge, you know, like that can be sweet or savory. So then if I tell you I've made a sugar cone with millet or sorghum, or pop sorghum to make like a pop sorghum ice cream, immediately, conceptually, I'm struggling, but also culturally, I'm like, what are you doing to my stuff?
My heritage.
You know,
Yeah.
so what are you doing to my heritage? So people get a little bit defensive around that, which of course I understand, but also ironically is most of the time people aren't aware that that ingredient or that food or that practice is relatively new to their culture because it came in from another group of people from the continent or from outside the continent. So this idea of being gatekeepers of culture, it's always a little bit funny to me because I would say for the most part on the continent, maybe 100 or 200 years is as far back as we can go and say this has always been like this. But if you say 300 years, it's a totally different landscape, right?
Yeah.
So we're trying to defend this idea of a pure culture as if it's always been this way since like, how old are we as a human? Like 200,000 years or something, you know, since like the very first hominids or whatever. Yeah. So they're polarizing because people have memories of how those things should be. And often you're fighting against people's grandmothers, people's mothers, or whoever used to make food for them. So it's a serious invasion into that home space. You're telling me, imagine if I made like I know cool sisters as a sweet treat, right? But imagine you come have made like cool sisters and I don't know minced curry. I don't know if that's unusual or not, but that can set people off. Like, no, that's like Sunday morning coffee and cool sister. What are you doing?
Yes.
You know, yeah.
Yeah, so people need to get out of the discomfort. And I think lastly, let's return to the plants. What is it for you, both scientifically and as someone who's from the soil of this amazing continent, that that connects you to working with our plants?
I think plants they offer so much in a way that's relatively accessible to most people once we are aware of that access. They can be medicinal, they can be edible, they can be culturally, spiritually relevant, they can be insecticide, they can be repellents. There's so much complexity behind like plant chemicals, phytochemicals that we've been using for so long. But because we're now in this new format of consumption where we're used to people giving us plants for a particular purpose, typically for food, we've lost a lot of that richness and usefulness around the plant. You know, like you can take one plant species and do so much with it before you throw it away. But now I get the leeks, I cut off the roots, I cut off the shoots. I just want the white part in the middle for my risotto, and that's it, right? There's no use beyond it. So I think it's such a, I don't know if dictionary is the right word, right? But looking at Fambos, right? That's a huge compendium of books.
Yes.
In that collection of plants, right? That we will never be able to finish writing, reading, or using or processing. So if you just pick one plant and obsess about it for the rest of your life, you won't be done. It's such a waste to not use those resources and not celebrate those things. And what's beautiful about them as well, they're balanced with how they've evolved to the land, specifically in the Cape. So a lot of them are hardy and sturdy and rugged, which means they have a lot of bold flavor as well. So we can use them in sparingly amounts. They use less water. There's just such a beautiful range of plants that if you're in the Cape or the Greater Cape area,
Well,
it
everywhere.
makes sense.
So that's the thing is, so if people will be tuning in from everywhere, and it's whatever you said there applies to the grasslands, the desert,
Wherever you are.
you know, yeah. There's a unique set of plants that are adapted to that. It's amazing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we take it for granted, and there's so many plants you walk past every day that you don't know have a benefit, right? But speak to maybe my grandmother's generation, you'd be amazed about what she used to give us guavas for all sorts of ailments, like guava leaves,
Yes.
right? But now these days, even eating a guava is like, I'll just have the guava juice, you know, like like this disconnection. Yeah, so I wish more people would really get into plants, because they offer so much for very little effort.
Yeah, they're just there.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Tapiwa, for joining us. And we'll continue the conversation in some space. And take care and all strength for your endeavors.
Thank you very much, man. Enjoy the rest of the chat and good luck with your change, the wardrobe change.
Yeah, so that went in very different directions. And this food use consumption space is a complex one. So it behooves us to dip into all these things, which includes identity. Later on, Zayaan will touch on our relationships with the land, etc., etc., etc. So at this moment in time, Hennie, I'm going to ask you to put on your camera and microphone. I'm going to make you host so that you can share. And we'll hear what you have to say. Hennie, can you hear my word?
Yes.
There we go.
Thanks, Rupert. But I think I can't put my camera on.
Just check.
Okay,
yeah.
there we are.
You've got it. Okay.
Good.
Okay. So Hennie is joining us from the University of Pretoria. Hennie, can you give your title? I've lost my notes here on my table.
Good. Hi, everyone. So thanks, Rupert, and thanks, Richard, for making this possible. So I'm a culinary arts lecturer at the Department of Consumer and Food Sciences at the University of Pretoria. I have a variety of research interests, but I'm essentially a trained cook, and I cook a lot at home, at university, and I have a real big passion for food, whatever food, but particularly so these days also what is immediately around us and available. Rupert said something earlier about cherries and how they suddenly available all around. So I'm also a consumer scientist, and that brings me to a point that I have very moral high ground about, and that is that, you know, a lot of what is available in the shops and available on the market is consumer driven, and Richard touched on that. And I think there's actually, in fact, a bit of a danger in that, because we lose so much interest and variety, in the sense that not everything can always be available throughout the year. So my personal opinion is that we should not encourage that type of behavior where cherries should be available all round. When I shop, I'm very aware of what is inexpensive at that point, because that's often an indication that something is in season. And then, you know, you get to learn seasonality over time. I refuse to buy asparagus when it's not asparagus time and pay 35 Rand for a small bunch of asparagus. I want to wait until the asparagus are in season in South Africa, and then they are also at their best. And I think many food producers and farmers also think like that, but if we don't encourage consumers to not be so demanding in the fact that they always want everything available year-round, then we lose that diversity and that interest that comes around with things being seasonal at certain times of the year. But then I have to contradict myself, because I am also a hospitality person and I cook often for people, and that brings another dimension to it. So restaurants, restaurant owners, chefs want to be able to plan ahead. They want to know that they can get things at certain times. And in this space where we're talking about indigenous plants, indigenous foods, locally harvested, foraged things, that becomes really problematic. You know, if I ask Richard and Jason at the university that I want to do a menu in 3 months' time, tell me what's going to be available, they are very helpful because they're very skilled in knowing what is going to be in season. But there's a problem in that there's no guarantee that there is going to be enough available at that point, what the quality is going to be. So we're a little bit in a dilemma. On the one hand, we want to encourage seasonality. We want to eat things that are really at the best, at their prime in that moment. But on the other hand, we also like this idea of things being readily available all round. Richard talked about, Richard, remind me, that African potato-y thing that you guys brought me. So I got to work with those the first time, and they are hell to work with. They're difficult to peel. They are complex in the structure that they are put together. They are delightful to eat. I can tell you that they have a most amazing flavor. They are nothing like potato. They have a wonderful earthy flavor, and they are really delicious. Roasted, we made purees with them. There was all sorts of application of that. But then you get to the point where you think, okay, so do I have the time and the energy to sit and peel these little fiddly bits of things? Perhaps I just want to buy a good old-fashioned big potato, and then I am sorted, and you know, I don't have to worry about the skin and so on. So this is a complex discussion. I work with Potato South Africa quite regularly, and we have 2 students that are doing work for them. And one of the things that I didn't know, but South Africa is one of the few countries in the world where the consumer drives the need for potatoes to be washed. So potatoes in general, if you go to other countries, are sold in an unwashed state. And the washing of potatoes diminishes the shelf life incredibly. So I get that. People work, people are busy, they don't want to cook all that often. They don't have the time to cook all that often. So when they cook, they don't want it to be complicated. They want it to be straightforward, and they want it to be a pleasure to do that. They don't want to be sitting there peeling little bits of complex tubers. So I don't know. Fortunately, I'm at the receiving end of these things. I love experimenting. I love having people at home to try these things out, but I do understand that from a commercial point that we need much more research in this whole area of indigenous edibles and plant material. So I've got no fancy slides. I put this, I started this one because it's interesting for me to see how our country, South Africa, is made up of all the different areas and the different plant material that grows in there. This, I think, is an equally interesting map to show the different land use and what is being planted there or grown there or farmed there. And it shows you that there's also big areas that, you know, you can do nothing else than have a sheep farm or whatever. So the next few slides are of restaurants or eateries that I know utilizes a lot of indigenous ingredients. I've just had the pleasure in September to go on a little food tour of the Western Cape, and we started off this our eating excursion for a Sunday meal at Wolfgat, which is the little restaurant in Paternoster where Kobus van der Merwe does dune foraging and applies a lot of those ingredients in his menu. So this is just a collection of stuff that he often features. I don't want to throw names around, but on this particular day that we had the meal, Kobus van der Merwe, who's the chef owner of Wolfgat, did a collaborative meal with Jan Hendrik van der Westhuizen, who's the guy that has a Michelin restaurant in Nice, but is now also running a restaurant in the Tswalu Reserve that is called Kleinjan. And it was interesting to see their two different applications of indigenous ingredients. We had just heard from our previous speaker about Mupani worms, and it was wonderful that Jan Hendrik van der Westhuizen did a little entree, and then he finely grated dried Mupani worms over this. And in that application, you know, all the sort of disgust that people might have for something is immediately taken away. So there is a space for chefs, for culinary experts to introduce us to these ingredients so that they aren't perhaps a little bit offensive. We heard from the previous speaker about this sort of gloopiness. Jason and Richard are forever bringing us new green leafy vegetables because they are so hugely researched at the moment, but for the sake of nutrition. And many of them have that sort of gumminess, and I agree, you know, you want to know how to deal with this. This is from a professional chef, Gregory Henderson, who has something that he calls the Wild Food Revolution, and he operates out of Cape Town. And he made this really wonderful tortoise-like dish with wild turnip and waterblommetjies and heirloom beetroot that he made into that little shell there. This is a similar dish that he has made. So using, you know, rosemary from the Strandveld. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of stuff that is interesting and out there at the moment. This is from a student at the ICA in Stellenbosch, the Institute of Culinary Arts, and it was wonderful. This was, I think, 2 days ago that I got it off Instagram, and she says that she used kapokbos to make a dressing for that salad. So people are really interested in these things. I don't know if any of you know Bertus Basson, but he's the owner of various restaurants in the Western Cape, amongst other this restaurant that's called Acre in Stellenbosch. And this is his head chef there. And I love this little thing that he says there, that these are bokkums, that is what finishes off our fish and chips course. And he says he likes it because he thinks of it as fish parmesan. And those of you who have had bokkums before, you know, they're very salty, they're very fishy. But again, if you just grate them very lightly over something, they are going to be like fish parmesan. I love these little carnations, and I took this off Instagram as well. They're from the Cedarburg, and I have a really big passion for indigenous flowers. I work with another researcher from plant sciences, and we're trying to encourage people to not just buy those little plastic containers of pansies and what else goes in those silly boxes that you buy at the spa, but to be aware of what is around you and what is available and edible, because you know, in that sense we can encourage small farmers, we can encourage people who have got no farming background to get into the motion of this, and perhaps they can make a business from that and sell things to restaurants and so. I love monkey orange. We do lots with them when they are available. They have a really unique flavor. Of course, marulas, and then on the right hand, strawberry guavas that Jason tells me is in fact not indigenous, and that they are a really bad invasive species, but they are completely lovely. They have such a unique guava flavor. I adore them. These are makatan that I have to tell you that I grew in my garden in Rittendale in Pretoria. We made them in wonderful pieces like Afrikaans people do, those glacé fruit, and they are completely wonderful. I've had that pap where the pulp inside is incorporated into maize pap. It is delicious. It is one of the most wonderful fruits or vegetables around. We should encourage people to plant them. A desert cucumber, it makes the most gorgeous fresh sorbet. It's nothing like cucumber. It's zingy. It almost has a seaweedy flavor, and it is delicious. I wish we could have Jason, Richard. That's something that we need back on Future Africa's garden. These came from there, so I don't know what happened to them. So Richard previously spoke about the Mondia. This is my absolute favorite. I found out, and I have no gardening or plant background. My science education is not around the plants or the growing or the cultivation of plants. So I want to use them. And Jason told me that actually, in fact, it's not so common to use the bark and primarily the roots, and that's why they are they are almost extinct, because people have to remove the whole plant to get to the roots. But I tell you now that if you have had the dried bark, you will never want to buy vanilla again. So come along to the university, beg Richard for some plants. He says they can take over an entire pergola in a very quick time, and then you have this wonderful strips that you remove from the bark, you dry them, and they are really quite wonderful. I made these little buns on the right hand, which are just little Chinese steamed buns, but we put Mondia in there. So of course, because they have this wonderful vanilla flavor, they work really well with desserts. But I wanted to push the limits a bit and apply them in a savory context. And in that sense, I do want to encourage all our listeners today to be aware of the place that research plays in this whole discussion. We, I don't know who of you know Nasterhol, those really deep, dark, black little berries. In South Africa, they are quite a cultural used product, but they primarily are found in a jam form. So you buy these bottles of pitch black jam, and they are lovely. But we wanted to use them some years back in a savory application, or not even just a savory, but something that was slightly less sweet. So we wanted to make a panna cotta from that. And I tell you now that with all the scientists in our building, we still weren't able to stabilize the color. So it's still unknown why, when there's such a vast quantity of sugar in with the msoba, that it can then remain so pitch black and dark. But the moment you lessen the sugar, it either goes brown or green or yellow or whatever. And we wanted to make a panna cotta so that you get the taste of the actual fruit and not that deep jamminess. But in any case, so if you have a child or a nephew or a niece or a cousin that wants to come to university, we have a wonderful research project for them. The left-hand bottom corner picture there are pas de fruit, those little jelly baby or fruit jelly thingies that are all handmade, and they are made from a variety of indigenous fruits that we found from the left. That was the Makatan to Cape Gooseberry to the right. The powder in this is just good old-fashioned waterbessie, and this was just a plated dessert with sort of a deconstructed pavlova with custard and meringue and a few berries. But because waterbessie has got such a short fruiting season, it's often a good idea, particularly for us, to harvest as much as we can, and we were able to dry them in a dehydrator and then powder them, and they are really well used then. This is my absolute favorite, and I have to tell you that after the past few days rain, I see on the open property next to my house that the blackjacks have all sprung up, so I cannot wait to make a risotto again, and it's really wonderful. I tell you that if you have tasted blackjack risotto, you don't want to eat spinach risotto ever again. So they are simply blanched. I puree them, and they go in with the risotto right at the end, and it gives this sort of khaki-ish green color. I've put a little bit of dried blackjack on top, but there's also a meat sauce around it. So a really delicious, unctuous dish. These were fruit leathers that we made from stamvrug. Those of you who know stamvrug, so they also have a short season. They were pureed, spread on a silicone map and dried, and they make these wonderful big pearls that we could decorate a cake with. Num Num biscuits, really wonderful fruit, one of my absolute favorite. Another little bit of dried fruit leather that was just cut in a circle and used as a decoration on a cheese plate, and that was made from sand apricot. Of course, speckboom. This is a commercial brand of speckboom varieties that they make, a speckboom and apricot relish, and one made with fig as well. I adore speckboom and have lots of it in my garden. These are rose apples, and we have a wonderful tree on campus close to this giving garden, or in fact in the giving garden that Richard have spoken about earlier. They are hell. You pick them today, tomorrow they rotten. You can't do anything with them. So they are wonderful plants. They're not indigenous, but they bear a lot of fruit, and they have a wonderful, wonderful taste. You will not know that there was no artificial rose water in that dish that you made. And I've made a variety of things with them, from ice cream to sorbet, to these little pots of rose apple jam. They unfortunately fruit in the first or the second week of January, and then there's nobody on campus, and I always lose them. Of course, Amadumbi, wonderful, made a Amadumbi and curry soup and had a sorghum and cumin cracker there. Guinea fowl with msoba chutney. So those are actually, in fact, fresh msoba berries on the plate there in the picture on the left, and that came from Futures Africa when there was msoba at some point. You know, so the application of indigenous ingredients can be really quite simple, like a soup, or high-end like these where we made a seed crisp with wild garlic in and some other ingredients. So there's a Malva pudding that had some carob in. We have wonderful big trees of carob just outside of our building. Carob is another item that is not so easy to process because you have to take it out of that peel, and that's me. Rupert, I have to right click and
make me host, yeah.
Make you host again.
Thanks, Hennie. That was great, because I think it's you know, people struggle to see things within a fine dining aspect, and obviously the fine dining, it's a little bit like Formula One, you know, it's the cutting edge stuff, and then you figure it out, and then it gets into the mainstream. So hopefully there's takeout, and I've already seen some of your students doing amazing stuff and getting involved with some of the chain stores and so forth. So yeah, it's starting to happen.
Yeah,
Cool.
you know, one of my fellow lecturers talks about the development of food like fashion does. You know, you first have the real couture designers, and they make these way out things that's on a runway, but as fashion evolves, it you can buy it in your Pick n Pay clothing shop, and I think that's what we want to encourage. I want to go to the spa and I want to buy one of those tubes with mondia, dried mondia inside there, and I'm not saying that it has to replace vanilla that comes from Madagascar, but it can be a complementary flavor to that. You know, we use so little of our indigenous produce.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we'll have a proper discussion in a bit, but I'm gonna play the next video. Thanks so much. Okay, so our next speaker is Zayaan Khan, who is by training a horticulturist. These days also doing quite a lot of art, but doing food and the connections with food, land, seed, and people in a very interesting way. So I'm going to let her speak for herself, and then after that we will have a discussion. Remember to stick your questions into the Q&A, please. Thanks for joining us. I think within the context of the conversation, it's always nice to have different voices. So we're dealing with the growing, the customer element of it, even the kind of academic approach to people working with indigenous foods. And as a practitioner in your own right, what do you think would be a useful message to kind of help tie this together?
Well, I guess often the element that gets left out, which also speaks to where we are at in our current kind of epistemological, cosmological paradigm currently, coming out with the big words first, is the thinking and the understanding around our spiritual contexts with our connection with land, with our relationship, our kind of moving, evolving relationship with land and sea, and how that often gets kind of relegated to the more esoteric You know, sometimes even people use the word holistic in the same way. And in my practice and in the work and in the knowledge that has been bestowed unto me in the many years that I've been doing this work, I'm very affronted by that, and I'm very offended by the way that spiritual practice and that deep connection gets kind of relegated, and often people who are practicing in these ways are criminalized or are, you know, deemed not, you know, to not have as much access as others who perhaps are more scientifically minded or connected. And I often think about when I was doing work with Simon's Time Museum, and I was trying to figure out what, you know, as a collective with the museum, trying to figure out which stories often get left aside and we don't hear enough of when it comes to our very ancient and deep connection with land. And I was speaking with my dear friend Tony Stewart, and she immediately was like, because this was now 2020, 2021, and she was saying, you know, with this lockdown and the fact that we're not allowed to go to the beach, we're not allowed to go to the mountain, one of the big things that we struggle with is that we aren't allowed to effect our ritual practices, and we can't have our ceremonies. And it struck me so much, because that was like one of the biggest kind of silences that we don't speak about, and that, you know, when people are stuck in lockdown and when we're kind of trapped from, you know, from these sacred places, and these, I mean, it's undoubtedly sacred places. Everybody who goes to the mountain will tell you that, that there's something that begins to be missing from our lives. So if I can even ask you, Rupert, if you aren't allowed to go to the land, you know, if they told you you had to work in an office forever, you know, a part of you would die.
Yeah. I mean,
and so
that happened during lockdown, you know, the fact of you could only go from home to shop and so forth. So I think then even more so when we're dealing with things that we consume, whether it's medicinal, cultural, spiritual, you've got to honor that aspect of the plant and the nature and the person.
Because I feel, and I'm very sensitive to it, but there has to be a reciprocity when we go to the land and we harvest, when we go to the sea and we harvest, because we come from such extractive natures where we think that, you know, things are owed to us. And when we go harvest, when we go forage, use that word, that we don't, it is about taking. And because of the way that a lot of that has been criminalized because of, you know, South African National Parks land, and the way that we think about commonage, the way that we think about tenure, the way that we understand land and property and ownership. A lot of that kind of got pushed to the wayside, or a lot of that, especially because a lot of us are children of repeated forced removal. We don't have that intimate relationship where it's about that reciprocity. And that's very dangerous, because it kind of begets this continual anthropocentrism and the centering of self that is very difficult to consider the other. And we see this a lot when we see kind of botanists running around the field, harvesting things left, right, and center. And then when people are harvesting medicinally, which I'm not saying, like, we've inherited a system where, and we have to recognize that this system is a colonial system, where land was stolen. And so when people were going to harvest medicine, it wasn't at the rate of detriment that it is now, because so much of land has been taken up by development, or into agriculture and all of these things.
And private,
so
and state as well, yeah.
And state, exactly. And so we've inherited a system that's so precarious that criminalizes some and not others. It kind of makes some more valuable than others and some more knowledgeable than others. And so I just want to speak for that and speak to that, because in my work, having worked in Indigenous food for a long time, since kind of focused specifically since 2009, when I was kind of still working in the nursery sector, in the horticultural world. And very quickly, I mean, it took quite a bit of time. It took another, 7 years or something, for me to really burn out, because I was really trying to push for the fact that we need to, there's a revival of Indigenous food that's happening, and really it must be a restitution, but there wasn't a lot of conversation about the political history of that, and how quickly all of that was becoming exclusive, and that there was no discussion about where that knowledge comes from, and where that those food stories come from. And in that early time, and getting to the point, a lot of my work within this kind of world, because our terroir, if I can say that, is of a very bitter nature. The flavors here are extremely bitter and very high in tannins, and so require a lot of processing, a lot of slow cooking, a lot of slow leaching, which is kind of the antithesis of what we, kind of what we have now in the instant gratification of good salt and sweet sugar. And so it was very difficult to understand how to process those foods initially. And what would start to happen to me, because I would pray a lot, and I would obsess in my ADHD nature, obsess about these recipes. I started getting what I can call downloads. I started getting dreams and started getting visions about how to prepare these foods. And then we'd be like, okay, that's a bit weird, but let me try. Let me just see what happens. And after a process of leaching for a few days and then fermenting, this amazing obeya, for example, would taste like a mix between artichoke and asparagus. And if you've ever eaten obeya or any of their cousins, you will know that bitterness makes you think you will die. It is so bitter. But to process something of that nature into something that was delicious and made me crave cheese and all the rest of it, there's a power in that kind of download, and in the knowledges that do not come through the formative educational ways that we understand things. And if I can just say a point about that, so I understand that as ancestral guidance, as spiritual knowledge. June Bam, in her book OC Told Me, she speaks about here on the flats, kind of this Rondevlei, Princess Flay side of the Cape, the knowledge that exists here around how people would understand, for example, the knowledge of the wind, and the strength of dreams as ways of knowing, as building entire epistemologies on dreaming, especially the dreams of children. The importance of sitting around the fire and sharing stories so that communities understand, and that messages get taken across, and that knowledges become communal. And this is not new. Dreaming as a form of valid knowledge systems is something you find around the world. It's like the old way, the original, the OG internet. Knowledge is about, reading the wind and reading the fog on the ocean, particularly around around death and the coming of death, and if it's going to be a man or a woman that's going to die. And she speaks about it in the way that it's the same validity of knowledge to know that than we know about, which insects are going to come for which crop in our agricultural land, or how we manage, soil science, and where all this knowledge comes from. I mean, I can talk for days about seed knowledge and where all that stuff comes from. But to understand that sciences and the way that the legacy of where these sciences come from, pre-colonial, and how we know what we know, is so extremely valid, because that the age of that is so ancient in our evolutionary understanding and knowing, that we have to kind of pay mind to it and not forget it. So I'm here to speak about that spirit, about that inherited knowledge that we often forget about, and often gets kind of relegated to the crazies and forgotten about.
Yeah, and as you're talking about being receptive. I mean, ultimately in the plant conservation, any other protection space, it's about being receptive to more than just the obvious, whatever that may be. And obviously that's a 3-day conversation by itself. But the first step is being into nature, listening, and also interacting with a broad array of people so that you can get your blind spots examined. So do you have any questions for our other guests? So that's Prof. Hennie and Richard Hay.
Hi, Richard. Hi, Prof. I'd be interested, because I know this is quite, I'm pushing on the provocations here. But I'm really interested to know, and I love, like, even in my research around seed relationships, I love these kind of stories, especially of people who are so, not that you gentlemen are this, but people who are so embedded in their science and rigid in their science, and that there's not space for movement in that. But I'd really love to hear about what, if you've had these experiences where, say, for example, you're looking for, I mean, I've had this happen to me even in the city, when you are looking for a plant and thinking about plant communication, and you're looking and you're looking and you're looking and you're like, ish, I've got to go in like 5 minutes, I better find this plant. And then it arrives and there you are, and you've been connected to this plant. So something similar to that, if you've had those kind of experiences, if you'd like to share with us, please.
Oh, that would be awesome. I mean, I've both had and not had that in the field, when you're out looking for a specific rare or pretty plant that is in an area. And then sometimes you soften yourself and you find it. And other times, we've just had this week where we went out and we were obviously 2 weeks too late to get the seeds of this thing. And now we know next year we're 2 weeks too late. But yeah, it's a very different kind of listening. What would you call it? Planetary listening that we need to tune ourselves into.
Yeah, I mean, it's a common, especially as in kind of African context, I mean, here we call it lalela. It's that deep listening, sona ora, like you don't need ears to hear that. It's like listening with the heart and listening with the ancients, it's that
full body listening.
Our way. Yeah, and if we think about it again, evolutionarily, our survivorship before these brick and mortar ways of being, before sitting all day, and when we needed so much more of our sensory selves, that's how we survived. It's such a common, it is not esoteric, it's such an ancient way of being, because otherwise you would die if you didn't have that deep listening, and you couldn't, And so I really like, I mean, that's, and children also, it's so wonderful to live with children because they have that. It's such an inherent thing. And so we can learn so much from them as well. Yeah, cool. Man.
Thank you, Zayaan. And have a lovely summer. Take care. Yeah, so Richard and Hennie, if you could put on your cameras. I don't know, Richard, if you want to answer that question from Zayaan first.
Yeah.
And then we go into some of the ones from the chat.
Jason and I every year go out and collect marama beans, Tylosema esculentum. And our one site is this last fragment of grassland that's being encroached upon both by development and from an illegal dump site. So we've been very proactive in collecting seeds from there. It also seems to be a very high producing selection for whatever reason. But the marama beans typically are only found on top of dolerite. So we got to walk through this veld and try and find these things. And the last time we went, we just weren't finding plants. And yeah, both of us just had a feeling, no, at the other end of this fairly tall grass section, it looks like it starts to get a bit more rocky with some shallower, more prostate grass species. And as we came over the ridge, it was just a field of these marama beans. Honestly, the highest producing plants we've ever found. So the picture of them in my presentation, that's the seeds that we grew out for the Giving Garden. And yeah, it really was just taking in a moment, looking at the land, thinking deeply about what sort of habitat are we looking for to find these plants. And yeah, it was a really cool experience.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem with this conversation, is like in your answers you raise more questions. So like the first thing there is that there is variation in our plants, you know, so the same species or subspecies across a range will have different properties.
Yeah.
And so from some would be great from a yield point of view, but maybe it doesn't taste as good, or
Yes.
you know what I mean? Like so there's and that's why it's important from a conservation point of view to try and at least keep as much variety as possible, so that people like yourselves and me and everyone else can get there and at least sample the place.
Absolutely.
And before we lose it. And that's why the kind of citizen science stuff just becomes so important as well. You know, at least to begin that documentation, first receiver process. Cool. Because this is a conservation seminar, I did get a bunch of messages on WhatsApp about and there was also a question in the chat on the same subject about the invasive nature of these plants. Yeah, do you want to just respond to that?
From your point about the variations, obviously from an agricultural perspective, which is what I'm looking at, we are always looking for yield above all else. We can always improve flavor later, but we're trying to find high yielding selections of like marulas, the marama beans, the Tsenza. But that is an evolutionary trade-off largely against invasive potential. The biggest trade-off with domestication is that this plant is now geared to produce something that we are going to be harvesting, not necessarily its long-term survival. And that's why the more common crops that we see, like the maize behind me, look nothing like its wild ancestors. We also, obviously being a botanical garden, we screen everything that we bring in. Obviously my talk just gave a very brief overview of the work that we do, but we do screen to make sure that we're not bringing in anything illegal. We are checking that it doesn't have invasive potential that we know of. We grow it out under very controlled conditions first before it moves out into the garden, etc. So we are quite selective like that. But very few of the things that we've ever looked at actually have any form of invasive potential into wild ecosystems. Something like Mondia, which is fairly unaltered, is pretty good at spreading in urban areas. So it pops up in our gardens, the seeds that we leave. But yeah, no evidence so far that it's invasive, and it is a South African species. I think the question specifically asked about the tubers. So Tsenza,
yes.
It seems there's a couple of relic populations. There's a few specimens found outside Nelspruit, and then in KZN there's one relic population, but that population actually seems to be a historical site, and it hasn't spread anywhere, and it hasn't been found anywhere else. So it seems to be a remnant of a settlement. Tsenza is quite weird. It spreads all the way up to West Africa, but there's huge variation along the way. I'm still not convinced that what is called Coleus esculentus in West Africa is what we call Coleus esculentus. I think there are differences. It's just no one's looked at it yet.
Sure. And that's where the taxonomists come in. So, you know, it's like people at Zambia and everywhere else who are working on that group to help pick it apart. Okay, so I'm going to bring in Hennie. Hennie, do you have a response to what Zayaan was saying about do plants talk to you? And I know you're more in the kitchen and the classroom, but what's your experience there?
I think, Rupert, for me, and I think it brings me back to the point of seasonality, and I think I personally would wish that I had a better understanding of plant growing in context of feeding myself and those around me, because it takes the frustration out of things. You know, I have a bad thing about buying herbs. I adore herbs, but I I think it's criminal that I have to pay for herbs. And then, I get to grow broadleaf parsley and I have a glut of it and it's wonderful. And then they go into seed and I have for various months no parsley. And I think for me, it's about being in tune with plants, in the sense that I understand that that's the way it should work. I shouldn't have parsley at certain times of the year, so that I look forward to having them when they are meant to be there. And that's something that we have to open ourselves to, is that thing. And that's what we spoke of earlier, is that food items should perhaps not always be available at all times. And yeah, so it's a very practical aspect for me. I just want to add something onto the little bit of chat that Richard had about the place where plants are grown, and perhaps everyone in the audience here knows this, but I didn't know that. So potatoes in South Africa were at one point classified for use according to the varietal. So BP1 was classified as a roasting potato and a whatever for the other. And that's subsequently been proven to not be the correct way to do it. So we're involved in a PhD and a master studies where it's proven that the same varietal of potato can grow in different soils and produce different types of potato. And that relates a little bit to, what we're talking about, being in connection with plants. Perhaps it is, we live in a modern society where transport makes it easy for us to have things available that aren't of our immediate environment. But if we were to be a little bit more open to understanding how plants grow, where they grow, why they grow, why they are seasonal, we would also be more innovative in our eating habits and not just be reliant on those X, Y, and Z items that we can get from the shop at all times, and they taste like that.
And that's exactly the thing that Tapiwa also touched on. And I happened to be at the South African Museum yesterday, and there's a whole new exhibit on the evolution of man and the different species of hominids found in Africa and all the rest of it. And so this eating non-seasonally is literally like a phenomenon that's maybe 5 decades old. Before that, you had to go with what you had for most of our existence as humans. So to get back to that would kind of help kind of jolt us towards that connection that we seem to have lost with the planet on all aspects. So I'm all for what you're proposing. Richard, there was also a proposition for you in Diepsloot. I don't know if you want to address that from Kathleen.
Any of you on this webinar listening to this thing, reach out to us at Future Africa at the University of Pretoria. We love helping community projects. I am involved in hundreds of food gardens. So we love that. Come visit us. We will give you material. We will show you what we have. We will talk about these things. Yeah. And if you're too far away to visit us physically, I had my email address at the end of my talk, but I'm sure we can share it at the end. Reach out. We have networks of people who grow.
I'll put everyone's kind of website or contacts when we post it onto the Botanical Society website. Yeah. So that will get everyone kind of in contact.
Perfect.
Cool. Okay, so we start. No, go for it.
There's a question about the brassica. So Muchaina is largely thought to be Brassica rapa subspecies chinensis, much like bok choy. I find that growing it seems to be more like a mustard. So I think it's more similar, it's probably a Brassica juncea, or at least a hybrid. Hennie can attest, the taste is very much like a mustard. It's generally my favorite leaf vegetable at the moment. So it's something we are heavily propagating to get seed out. It's fantastic. And like I said, it was picked up in Venda. We know very little about it other than it's a great tasting leaf vegetable of questionable origins.
Yeah, and we've done a variety of things with it. We've stir fried it in a wok. We've we've dried it, put it in a sort of a steamed bun like a dombolo. We have used it raw in a wrap. We have made a Caesar salad version of it, and each of these applications, there's a new aspect to the taste of it. It's quite varied. It's not just this standard green leaf with one taste profile. It has a wonderful complexity.
Yes. I see Rupert put in the chat, it's an article I wrote after, I think it was our Heritage Day thing at Moja Khabedi, anyway, your students cook all of this. Yeah, so honestly, mochaina, fantastic leaf vegetable. If you're looking for a winter green, mochaina all the way.
Awesome.
Very passionate.
Okay, any parting shots from the two of you?
I'll let Hennie go first, and then.
So Richard invited you to the gardens. You're welcome to pop around to our building as well and come in for a meal. Richard one Sunday spent a day in the kitchen with me when we had an event there. So if you're really keen, you can come around and we'll make you a high table there, and you can watch the inner workings of our kitchens.
I'm gonna be there in February, so great.
That's good. You're invited.
Thank you.
We are also potentially looking at hosting a couple of events using Hennie and his team next year in collaboration with the Transformation Office here at UP, Future Africa, and BotSoc Conservation. So definitely stay tuned for that.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, guys, if you switch off your cameras, I'm going to say goodbye. and I really appreciate your contribution to this webinar. Yeah, as I said at the beginning, it's also my last webinar hosting it in this current format. So I had a bit of a reflection back to the first one, which was January 2021. We had the Red List team talking about the threats to our flora, and we've covered a hell of a lot of ground since. And I also just remember that those first few webinars was in the depths of lockdown. And afterwards we used to have an after party, so like a separate kind of meeting where we then just like hung out, whoever was on the call, and there were so many really lovely connections that were made there. So that's all. I just want to thank everyone for your attention, for sticking around for this extra long one today, but I'm sure you will agree that it was worth it. And tune in at the end of January to see what the Botanical Society will be up to next in this slot with the webinar. So we wish all attendees and BotSoc people and non-BotSoc people a safe and prosperous festive season, and enjoy spending time with your families and get some rest so we can take whatever 2024 is going to throw for us. So thank you so much, and that's it from me.